Hello everyone, welcome to Books and Booze, a series where I review books and where I review booze. I'm Alex, and this week I'll be talking about our very first nonfiction book on the channel, The Most Dangerous Animal, Human Nature and the Origins of War by David Livingstone Smith. Also, this time I'm going to have some wine. Smith makes some comments during the writing about how he often while writing was having a glass of red wine, so it felt fitting that I have a red blend called Our Daily Red from California. This is a 2020 California red wine. It's a different blend of different reds out of Sonoma. Yeah, by the looks of it. Not exactly sure the winery, but actually I think it's just called Our Daily Wines. It's the winery. I also have this thing, and if you know what it does, let me know in the comments. I think it removes like air. It does something to the wine that's supposed to help it. I don't know. I won it in like a gift basket a while back, so I just use it every time I have wine. Here's to David Livingstone Smith and The Most Dangerous Animal. This one's really interesting. It's definitely not a sweet red blend in any way. It almost kind of has a tartness to it, like dark fruit, like almost kind of a cherry flavor to it. So I quite like it. But if you're looking for a sweet red, I would stay away from this one. So if you're into more earthy, more tart, and it's a pretty solid buy. Anyway, so The Most Dangerous Animal is a philosophy, a history. It's kind of an interdisciplinary book by David Livingstone Smith, published in 2007. David Livingstone Smith is currently a professor of philosophy at the University of New England, so that's why it kind of has a major philosophical slant to his exploration of human biology and war. And what the book aims to do is explore how human, or what it is about human nature that makes war possible on a regular level. How can we regularly slaughter each other, particularly in the frame of war? He pushes away other occurrences such as genocide toward the beginning of the book and kind of lays out a distinction between the two. And what he argues is his main thesis is that war has always been with us in one form or another since prehistoric times. And then it'll also use some different observations about chimpanzees to argue that a penchant for group violence, specifically, which is what war is, has been bred into us over millions of years of biological evolution. That's kind of the crux of what he wants to argue and present in this book. And in order to do that, The Most Dangerous Animal pulls from evolution, history, anthropology, and psychology, just to show how our minds kind of have this dual nature about them. Because on one hand, we are this ferocious, dangerous animal that Smith presents and points to, but at the same time, we have sort of a deep aversion to killing and a horror about taking human life, which Smith also explores. And that's where I think his book gets really intriguing. It's an interesting read, whatever you think about any of those subjects. So I mean, if you're interested in any of those, you might kind of gravitate toward this one. Smith, from what I can tell, has been dealing with explorations of dark psychology, or kind of the darker side of humanity, for more than 2 decades. At this point, and this book is along those 2 decades. And that's just at least in terms of published work. I'm sure he's had a fascination with it before even his first publication. And he has a major focus on dehumanization and mass violence. And he often, like he does in this book, pulls from Freud and Kant. So take with that whatever you will. And as with this being our first non-fiction book on the channel, I'm going to ask you, my viewers and audience, to kind of give me some feedback over this format. I'll be doing something a little bit different than how we approach the reviews for fiction books and exploring what the fiction books are kind of showing us about the human condition as opposed to non-fiction books, which is something I want to incorporate on this channel regularly, is talking about non-fiction books that I read as well, because I tend to balance a fiction and a nonfiction at the same time. So I'm going to go over some things that I think maybe were roadblocks, or I didn't like, or just criticisms of the book, and then I want to go into what it taught me and what I learned. So a slight twist on what we usually do with fiction, which is like what I don't like and what I do like. But let me know what you think about that format, or if you have any suggestions on how I can improve it. So first things first, going into this, I think it's good to temper your expectations a little bit. This is such a massive scope to cover, and it's a challenge. And trying to explain war in like 200-ish pages is limiting to a certain degree, to say the least. The book is incredibly well organized. I think it's very concise and direct with its writing, and it's very well thought out. But its materialist approach, I think at times struggles to get more in depth than you might want it to, and it kind of limits itself to explore greater implications of some of its case studies, which is why I'm pretty interested in Smith's book on dehumanization, which is the most recent publication, called Making Monsters: The Uncanny Power of Dehumanization, because that feels like it's going to be a little bit more focused, and I feel like it's going to be a little bit more rich than kind of this book, which feels more like a survey. And just as an example of when these things are limited or they're just kind of brushed by, there's a comment later in the book made about Rwanda, and to a degree Smith sort of frames it as like, these two groups were living together for so long, how could they have erupted into this violence, and then he'll kind of use his case study of like, it's just bred into us and all this biological evolution framework to state his case that Rwanda seemed to just like happen. But if you dig into the history of Rwanda, if you go really, really in depth, like I have with another recent book, which I hope to bring to this channel, We Wish to Inform You Tomorrow That Will Be Killed with Our Families, which is a exploration of the Rwandan genocide that goes way back to the years of colonialization that occurred in the country. And with that, you know that this didn't just really happen. There were a lot of tensions in that country that had wide-scale influences over hundreds of years that led to that tragic event. But that's just like an example of like some of the things that might happen when Smith is trying to kind of roll through his thesis and pull on these case studies that he's a little bit limited about how in-depth he can go. Another thing I want to point to is, as I mentioned earlier, 2007 is when this book was published, and to a certain degree, I think it's a little bit a product of its time. And what I mean by that is there's, to a certain degree, a little bit of like a new atheist vibe to the book, a little bit. I have no idea what Smith's religious background is, but given that it's, post 9/11, there is a lot of just flippant, like anti-religious rhetoric going on here, to a degree where it gets a little bit over the top at times. Like, for example, toward the beginning of the book, when he's making the distinction about why genocide is different from war and why war will be explored here, not necessarily genocide, the entire section's about religiously motivated killings, which is a little bit odd. Just as we mentioned later in the book, he mentions Rwanda, but there's no mention of political or ethnic, like, motivated mass killings in that section specifically. Kind of gears toward religion, and he'll say different flippant things here and there, like there's no objective value to practicing a religion and things like that. That's also toward the beginning of the book, and that's not a knock. I get that there's a fair point to be made about religion being appropriated into atrocities, but to kind of hone in on that specifically, it's just giving really big post 9/11 vibes, and I kind of wonder if Smith would change up sort of how he's viewing that at this point, or at least writing about it at this point. And last but not least, like I said, there's a big naturalist and materialist lens to this work, and that's to say that, all the case studies of the chimps, and trying to pull that and applying it to human war, it's kind of meh, it's whatever. I get the connection, the formula, but I'm not necessarily buying it wholeheartedly. As another example, Smith makes a case for biological altruism at one point in the book, and There are two ones and one slips my mind, but the other one is basically like it benefits you to see the gene pool of someone kind of like you, so like a relative or a distant relative, be passed on, so therefore you would clearly help them. And I just don't think that holds much weight when I just look at the world around us. I see plenty of people sabotaging their families and sabotaging their loved ones for various reasons. So I don't know. I've always found biological altruism a little bit of a slippery slope, and it's definitely the case here too. And that's not to knock any of the arguments being made, but once again it gets back to that they feel a little bit limited in their scope, and there's less of an exploration of larger scale influences that might be metaphysical or even might be deeply woven into culture. And it's really trying to harken into an evolutionary standpoint about why war happens. Whatever evil is, it is certainly not something that can be seen, heard, touched, tasted, or smelled. If good and evil were really objective features of the world, we would need some form of extrasensory perception to detect them. The idea that moral values are objective simply does not hold water. And so that might be one of the instances in which maybe the pure naturalist viewpoint, I think, kind of hits like a meh point. So let's shift gears a little bit there, and don't let any of those criticisms stop you, because I think this is a fascinating read either way. And so if this subject matter interests you, maybe go toward it, and I can tell you some of the things that I learned from this here book. One is that dehumanization is an incredibly powerful and permissive force. This section is probably my main takeaway from The Most Dangerous Animal. There's a whole section on dehumanization. I also think it's Smith's best written section in the entire book. And that's another reason I'm really interested in diving into making monsters. Let me know in the comments if you'd be interested in a review for this. It's sitting in my pile of books to be read, so I'll eventually get around to it. So maybe we'll return to some of Smith's writing on this channel. It's a little bit of the opposite of kind of my criticism earlier on, where it's like the dehumanization section feels very in-depth, it feels very pointed, it feels very well thought out, and brings in so much more than just the biological evolutionary standpoint. Like, there's just a striking example that he gives about Gettysburg during that section. And he does pull on some of the biology in this section. For example, he gets into dehumanization because there's this thing with us where when we recognize someone's face, this kind of facial recognition thing, we have to view them as human, and that makes us hesitate to enact violence, to do heinous things toward them. His example in here is about Gettysburg. I actually need to fact check it because I think it's so fascinating. So he talks about the Battle of Gettysburg, and that at the end of the battle, you could tell that soldiers that were closer to the enemy in front of them actually often didn't fire their guns or would keep reloading their weapons as to not shoot the enemy that was right there in front of them. And instead you had soldiers toward the back of the lines that more so fired because they can't actually see the face of the other people across from them. And I thought that was just a really fascinating example, and I need to look into that a little bit more. And he also talks about the influence of drugs and alcohol used throughout history as a way to get soldiers to kill other people. All the way back to Vikings, who would basically, I believe he wrote, like, trip on mushrooms and embody different rituals before they went into a battle or into a raid, where then they just like thought they were a bear or something, and that was kind of a way that they were able to just lay waste to entire villages. And overall, I think his dehumanization section reveals the ambivalent nature of war that people have with it. I think it's just a really great example to think about other cultural products that we see that deal with the ambivalence of war, with the complications of war, whether that be films like Platoon or The Thin Red Line, that I have a video essay on my channel that kind of deals with that a lot too. I'll link it in the description. And Smith briefly sort of touches on that. He observes the writings of Mark Twain a little bit in the book, but I guess maybe because he's not so much as a cultural critic or thinker, he's not really pulling from that stuff as much, but I feel like that builds his case even more, and I'd be kind of interested to see if he uses that in making monsters. And that segues into another thing that I learned, where it's just, war should always be treated with some serious complication at hand. we've gotten used to boxing war in, as we have with tons of other subject matter and things that we deal with as people. And I think this book really works to combat that, and I really applaud it for doing that. And I think what Smith's doing with that is that he's presenting some really compelling evidence that people are hesitant to go to war, even if they fully believe what they're going to war for, despite the fact that he's arguing that we're literally bred for it. There's some kind of push and pull there which makes war way more complicated than we might give it credit for. Let's read a few sections here. However, saying that war is driven by biology is not the same as saying that it is inevitable. Indeed, the most important reason for teasing out the biological roots of war is to find better ways to prevent it. We may be able to unlock the door of our own prison. Human beings may not be doomed to war. We may be able to break its spell and take control of our future, but to do this we must be willing to look at ourselves and face some stark, unflattering truths. And I really applaud him for, at least trying to engage with this subject material with the goal in mind for a positive outcome and a way to help people grow. So, are we going to give The Most Dangerous Animal by David Livingstone Smith a toast of excellence? I don't know. I'm a little bit hesitant on this one, but what I am going to say is that it is absolutely toasting to him for this daunting effort that he took on. So, salute to David Livingstone Smith for that. One of the things that might detract from that is that the scope of this book is just a daunting project for anyone who is going to take it on. So kudos to him for wanting to do it. And in conjunction with that, I think there's something a little bit limiting about approaching something as massive as war in a purely scientific manner, which the writing at times seems to be aware of and digs its heels in a bit more. And I think certain sections of the book ring a little bit more powerful than others. And I think that's a testament to Smith's expertise in other areas that are just not, it's just such a difficult task. I think his expertise points to exploring war in a really valuable way, but man, it's difficult to try to compact that into 200 pages. Still, it's interesting stuff, and he did one hell of a job. So, again, salute to David Livingstone Smith. Thank you for reaching the end of this book review. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope that if you were interested in this book, it might have compelled you to go get it, or if you were on the fence about it, maybe you made a decision about whether to add this to your reading list or not. If you enjoy in-depth book reviews like this, please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a like. That really helps me out a lot and helps grow the community here. Also, if you're interested in in-depth video essay series, I do that on this channel. Currently, I'm working on a series about the concept of post-secularism. So if that interests you, please be sure to check out the other videos and playlists on my channel. And let me know what you thought about what I had to say about this book in the comments. We can start a discussion about it, whether it be things that I learned from it and I thought that Smith did very well, or maybe some of the criticisms I had toward it. If you've read this book, let me know what you thought about reading it as well. With that, again, thank you for watching this video, and I'll catch you all on our next exploration.